Though you may have ignored many intimations that such might be the case. Irrelevant. Let's say it comes as a shock. Well, what happens to you? Well, you don't know where you are. You don't know where you've been. That's interesting, eh? Because you think you know where you've been because you've already been there, but all of a sudden something can happen so that you are so flipped over that you don't even know where you were. So that means in some sense the past is dependent on the present, a very peculiar thing. You also have no idea where you're going. In terms of not knowing where you are, that's deep, eh? Because you might think, well, I thought I was in a marriage. That turns out to be wrong. I thought I knew who my wife or husband was. That turns out to be wrong. I concluded on the basis that I knew my wife, that I knew something about women. That turned out to be wrong. I thought I was in a relationship with someone I could trust. That is wrong. I don't know enough about trust. I'm obviously too gullible. And so what that does is throw virtually everything that's ever happened to me in severe doubt, right? That's the emergence of chaos. And that's this. Sometimes you're going from point A to point B, and something you don't expect manifests itself in the middle of your plan, but it's not such a catastrophe because you can just work around it. And then sometimes something pops up and like you just do not have a plan anymore. And so then you might ask yourself, just exactly where are you when you don't know where you are? And I would say that's a place. And it's actually a place that's well documented in classic religious and mythological stories. That's chaos. The Taoists, for example, they believe that the world is made out of chaos and order. Well, order, that's where you are when what you do gets you what you want. Chaos, that's where you are when you have no idea what's going on. And you might ask, well, is there a way that you should act when you're in chaos? And the answer to that is, there better be, because it's a place you're going to visit several times during your life. And everyone visits that. That's why it's an archetypal story. That's the descent to the underground. The underground is that horrible place that lurks underneath all of our presuppositions. It's the frigid lake underneath the thin ice that everybody's skating on. And it's something that can manifest itself at any moment. That's partly why in the Taoist symbol, the black paisley is chaos, by the way, and the white paisley is order. In the order paisley, there's a little black dot. Well, that's because order can turn into chaos, and does, at any moment. And the reverse is also true. Chaos can turn into order at any moment. And insight will do that for you. You know, alcoholics report that when they hit bottom. It's like there's a catalysis and they look at the world in a different way. You know, now they're a new person. They're back from the underground. They've risen from the dead, so to speak. You know, and it's partly because what looks like your right hemisphere is pretty good at inferring patterns in novel and chaotic places. It's kind of keeping track of things that happen to you that are anomalous. And it makes alternative maps of the world that are there for you to rely on, at least to some degree, if that ever becomes necessary. Now you might ask yourself, how upset should you be when something that you don't expect happens? Now it turns out that that is really a difficult question to answer, because what the problem is that when something you don't expect happens, you don't know what it is. And so then you might say, well, how upset should you get? And the answer to that is, you don't know. And so what happens is, first of all, you've got some built-in approximators. One would be your genetically determined level of neuroticism, which is basically sensitivity to negative emotion. If you're more sensitive to negative emotion, you're going to manifest more psychophysiological preparation per unit of threat or uncertainty, which is to say some people get more upset about the same thing than other people do. Now, who's right? Well, who knows? You wake up in the morning and there's a little ache in your side. It's like, well, what is that? Is it sore muscle or cancer? You don't know. And if you're hypochondriacal, well, it's going to be cancer. And sometimes the hypochondriac is right. And so he's the one that lives when he goes to the emergency room and finds out exactly what's going on. So it's an unanswerable question. Now, the other way that your brain determines how upset you should be is by calculating your position in the dominance hierarchy. Because the higher you are in the dominance hierarchy, the more resources you have at your disposal, And so the less upset you have to get when anything horrible happens. So if you're barely clinging to the bottom of the social structure, you can be sure that your brain is going to estimate any anomalous occurrence as a catastrophe, which is why people don't like being at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy, and it's also why people who are there die a lot sooner. And they die a lot sooner regardless of their absolute level of wealth. It's relative deprivation that counts. Okay, so here's a bit of a clue about how else your brain might calculate how upset you should be. Here's a little map of me when I'm doing something that I frequently do, which is to write a manuscript. So you might say, well, what are you doing when you're writing a manuscript? And that turns out to be a very complicated question. It's like, what are you doing when you read a book? Well, you're writing letters, or typing them. You're typing words, you're typing phrases, you're typing sentences, you're typing paragraphs, you're typing the structure that the paragraphs fit into, that would be the essay, okay? Then me anyways, I'm practicing science because I usually write scientific manuscripts, and that's part of embodying my professorial role, and then that's part of, hypothetically, being a productive citizen, although some of you might, differ with that given that I'm a professor. And then perhaps on the outside of that, or this is what I think is on the outside of that, is I'm confronting the unknown. And you might say, well, what are you really doing when you're writing a sentence? And the answer to that is you're doing all of these things better or worse. And if you're doing a really good job of writing a sentence, you're doing all of them at once. And that would be one of the things that would make the sentence particularly meaningful. Now, if something anomalous occurs, well, let's say the T on my typewriter gets stuck. Well, that's going to irritate me because then I can't type a sentence. Now, it's not going to irritate me too much because, it doesn't really interfere with my ability to be a productive citizen. So, I'm going to estimate the magnitude of how upset I should be when something unknown occurs by estimating where in the hierarchy of action that anomaly is disruptive. Okay, so let me run you through this again. So let's say, what's a good person? And you might think of that from an... Okay, so let me run you through this again. So let's say, what's a good person? And you might think of that from an objective perspective, but that would be a mistake. Because a quality like good is a pragmatic... What are you really doing when you're writing a sentence? And the answer to that is you're doing all of these things better or worse. And if you're doing a really good job of writing a sentence, you're doing all of them at once. And that would be one of the things that would make the sentence particularly meaningful. Now, if something anomalous occurs, well, let's say the T on my typewriter gets stuck. Well, that's going to irritate me because then I can't type a sentence. Now, it's not going to irritate me too much because, it doesn't really interfere with my ability to be a productive citizen. So, I'm going to estimate the magnitude of how upset I should be when something unknown occurs by estimating where in the hierarchy of action that anomaly is disruptive. Okay, so let me run you through this again. So let's say, what's a good person? And you might think of that from an objective perspective, but that would be a mistake. Because a quality like good is a pragmatic quality, and it's based on action, not on object. So here's how you decompose being a good person. So, a good person is a good parent. More than that, that's a subcomponent, right? A good parent is someone who has a job and takes care of their family. And then a person who takes care of their family is like, they can play with the baby or they can complete a meal. These are abstract concepts. You can't tell a 4-year-old, make a meal. And the reason you can't is because they don't know the subordinate components of making a meal. You can say, see that fork? Hopefully they know what a fork is. See that fork? Yes. Pick up that fork and bring that fork to the table and put it there. They can do that because their nervous system is organized enough to operate at that level of abstraction. But they can't do something like make a meal, which is, if you got a 3-year-old, you can't put them in their room and you say, clean up your room. They'll just look at you. And then when you come back in half an hour, they'll look at you again. You can say, hey, kid, see that teddy bear? Yeah. Pick up the teddy bear and put it on that space in the wall. And then once you teach the 3-year-old how to do 100 of those things, and they got it, they've got all the little motor routines, you can say, clean the room. You can encapsulate that entire set of motor routines within the higher order concept. So if you're being a good person, part of that is, well, maybe you're making a meal, and part of that would be, while you're cutting up the vegetables. But then things get interesting, because when you're cutting up the vegetables, what you're actually doing is gripping something and moving, and then that's no longer abstract, right? That's where your conceptual, philosophical presuppositions, like be a good person, hit the level of embodied material reality. That's the dissolution of the mind into the body. Now, if someone says to you, you should cut those vegetables more thinly, that might irritate you. But if they say, you're a bad parent, maybe observing the same phenomena, then you're going to get into a fight with them. And the reason for that is, obviously, if it's just a matter of cutting the vegetables thinner, all you have to do is make a minor modification in the hierarchy that constitutes your self-representation, or really yourself. It's not just a representation. But if you're not a good parent, it's like, if that's true, you got a lot of repair work to do. A lot of your world has fallen apart. And as soon as things fall apart, which they always do, you're in chaos, and as soon as you're in chaos, then your body defaults to emergency preparation, and you're stressed, and if you're stressed long enough, then you die. And so you don't like that. Stress, when your body gets stressed, what happens is, because it doesn't really know what's going on, it prepares for everything. That's the generalized stress response. Cortisol production does that. Cortisol production is good, it wakes you up in the morning, but if it's chronic, you get old. Like, it's so general in its negative actions that the best way to conceptualize its detrimental long-term effect is that it accelerates aging. So it makes you more likely to have heart disease and cancer and depression and Alzheimer's and diabetes and obesity. That'll do. It's enough. Any of those are enough to kill you. All right, so there's a hierarchy. That's a hierarchy of values. The higher the value, the less you want to have it disrupted. Now, there's a psychologist named Piaget. Some of you might know about him. Piaget was very interested in what happens to value structures and their hierarchical organization once they have to apply outside of the confines of a body. So here's a way of thinking about it. 2-year-olds basically hypothalamic. That's why they're so much fun. First they're happy, then they're sad, then they're hungry, then they're tired. You know, they just zip from one pretty straightforward and rather awe-inspiring motivational state to another. But at 2, they can't play. They can play by themselves, but they can't play with other children. They can't get that until they're 3. And they need to get it by the time they're 3, because if they don't get it by the time they're 4, they will never get it. And then you have an antisocial kid who's going to be an outsider for his entire life, and there isn't anything you can do about it. So that has to happen between 2 and 4. So what happens at about age 3 is that the kid learns how to play a game with another person. And what that game is fundamentally the development of the ability to share a frame of reference, which is what you're doing when you play Monopoly. It's like, it's stupid to play Monopoly, obviously. Who cares if you have a whole pile of counterfeit paper, right? But doesn't matter, because the way you're constituted is that your brain will treat anything you act like constitutes a valuable goal as if it's a valid framework of reference. And if it couldn't do that, A, you couldn't abstract, and B, you could not get along with other people. So you can sit around the table and you can say, let's pretend that Monopoly is a reasonable facsimile of reality, which you wouldn't say, but it's what you mean. And everybody says, yes, that would be amusing. And so then you set your goal, which is to get all the little hotels and all the money, and poof, your emotions go along for the ride. And what's so interesting about that is you can get everybody into the game. And so one of the things that's really interesting about people is that we can establish a shared fictional frame of reference, and it organizes all our emotions so they're predictable. That's also why we can watch movies. You go to a movie, you identify the hero. You figure out what the hero wants, poof, you're the hero. And the way that works is, you don't look at the hero and think about what he's doing and evaluate it emotionally and then feel it. What you do is you specify the hero's goal, and then you map him onto your body, and you read off the emotional responses of your own body, and that's how you understand the hero. So it's embodied. You're using your embodiment as a computational device that can run simulations of other consciousnesses. And it does that with the body. And we like doing that. You can go to a movie and, you know, you're Brad Pitt for an hour and a half. You know, and you're Brad Pitt doing remarkable things. And that's also how we understand other people. We're very good at that. So anyways, we have these shared frames of reference, like when we're playing Monopoly. Okay, so children at 3 learn how to play games. And that means they learn how to organize their own internal motivational states into a hierarchy that includes the motivational states of other people. And that means they can play. And that's what you guys do when you're out in the world. Like, we're playing a game right now. We all know the rules. That's why we can all sit in this room and play the game without fighting with each other. You know, and the room is set up like a theater, and we all know the theater game. And so, and the chairs are always facing this way at the moment, and so that's a hint that you should look forward, and this is raised, so, you know, the room is basically telling you what to do, because it's a stage, like all rooms, and because you're smart and socially conscious, you can walk into a staged room, and your body knows what to do. And if you're civilized and social, you just do it, then all the other primates can predict what you're up to, and they won't kill you. Yeah, well, that's what it means to be part of the same tribe. You know, and people are very peculiar creatures, and God only knows what they're up to. But as long as they're playing the same game you are, you don't have to know what they're up to, because you can predict what they're going to do, and you understand their motivational states. And so, part of the building and constructing of higher order moral goals is the establishment of joint frames of reference that allow multiple people to pursue the goals that they're interested in simultaneously. And then what you have to think about with regards to that is that not all shared frames of reference can manage that. There's a small subset of them that are optimized so that not only can multiple people play them, but multiple people can play them and enjoy them and do it repeatedly across a long period of time. So it's iteratability that partly defines the utility of a higher order moral structure, and that is not arbitrary. It's an emergent property of biological interactions, and you might say, well, it's kind of arbitrary because people can do what they want, but it's not arbitrary at all, because a lot of what's constraining your games is your motivational substructure and those ancient circuits that are status-oriented. And they operate within virtually every animal has a status counter. Creatures organize themselves into dominance hierarchies. The reason they do that is because that works. It's a solution to the Darwinian problem of existence. It's not just an epiphenomena. It's the real thing. So your environment, fundamentally, a huge chunk of your environment is dominance hierarchy, plus God only knows where you are. And that's order and chaos. And part of the reason that people fight to preserve their dominance hierarchies is because it's better to be a slave who knows what the hell is going on than someone who's thrown screaming and naked into the jungle at night. And that's the difference between order and chaos. And we like order better than chaos, and it's no wonder. Now, we'll invite a little chaos in for entertainment now and then, but it has to be done voluntarily. And generally, you don't want the kind of chaos that upsets your entire conceptual structure. You know, you're willing to fool around on the fringes a little bit, but, you know, when the going gets serious, you're pretty much likely to bail out. And no wonder. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about this chaotic domain. I can tell you a couple of things about it. It's the underworld of mythology. One of the things that's kind of interesting about the underworld is that it has a suburb, and one of the suburbs of the underworld is hell. And hell is the place where you end up when everything that you know falls apart, and you get resentful and bitter about it. And that's very, like, one of the things I've noticed in my work as a clinical psychologist, that there's 2 things that really do people in. 3, lying, that's not good. Apart from that, resentment and arrogance. If you get resentful enough, you end up like Elliot Rodgers and all those other people who go on random shooting sprees because they have a disagreement about the structure of existence and the fact that they ended up hypothetically at the bottom of the heap. So those are real places, and people get stuck in them, and they are not places that you would voluntarily choose to go if you had any sense at all. And I'll tell you, if you read the accounts of the people who do random mass murder, they'll tell you exactly where they are. And they'll tell you exactly what they're motivated to do. And what they're motivated to do is take as much revenge on existence as they possibly can imagine in the most unfair possible way as fast as they can possibly manage it. And that's their conscious aim, and it is not a form of insanity. They know exactly what they're doing. They have a precise idea of what they're aiming at. And it's a deep archetypal possession, for lack of a better word. Now, I want to show you how some of these things are mapped symbolically. They're not really symbols in my estimation, because a symbol implies that something is being represented. You know, that there's a reality behind the representation that's broader than the representation, and the symbol is just a shadow of it. These aren't symbols. They're representations that are as accurate as they can possibly be. I'll start with something that's rather easy to understand. Let's try, where is that? Yes. What happens when you look at the Medusa? You turn to stone. What happens when a rabbit sees a wolf? That's right, it turns to stone. That's right. The Medusa is a symbol, it's a representation of all those things that make you turn to stone when you look at them. Now look, animals can deal with threat, right? They have instincts to deal with threat. But zebras, maybe there's a bunch of zebras and they're out there in a herd. And there's a bunch of lions and they're right there. And the zebras, what are they doing? They're grazing. And you think, well, those zebras aren't very bright because there's a bunch of lions. Like, why aren't they, you know, in the forest building a fort to keep the lions out? But the reason they're not doing that is because although they can react to threat, they cannot conceive of the class of threatening objects. Now, human beings can conceive of the class of threatening objects. And so what civilization is, in large part, is an attempt to find a remedy for the class of threatening objects. Now, there are representations of those sorts of things. The Medusa is one of them. The reason it's feminine is very difficult to explain, and I don't think I have the time, unfortunately, but you'll have to take my word for it. You see the little cartoon of Robert Crumb off to the left there? He's got a big Oedipal problem, old Rob Crumb. And the problem with him, fundamentally, is his mother was something like a giant spider and did everything she possibly could to crush the life out of him, hence his remaining relationship with women. And so that's part of the reason why femininity can be something that turns you to stone. It's an experience that many men are familiar with, by the way, because the average man is rejected far more often than he's accepted. And since women are the gateway to reproduction, they constitute nature itself. And nature itself tells most men, you should go home and stay under your bed. There's lots of experiments done about this. So, for example, psychologists will have an undergraduate woman go out into the concourse and see how long it takes her to find someone who agrees to sleep with her. And that takes, like, 2 seconds after she asks the first man. And then they flip it, and they get your random undergraduate guy to do the same thing. It's, well, you can imagine the consequences of that, since many of you men have lived through it. Mother Nature, the woman wears the face of Mother Nature, and the face is generally rejecting, especially to men who are low in the dominance hierarchy, by the way, which is one of the things that irritates guys like Elliot Rodgers, and one of the things that motivates their desire to take revenge. And that's a universal phenomena. So that's part of the reason that the feminine is nature, and why nature, by the way, is Mother Nature. It's like its diagnosis of your status is not good enough, and no wonder. What seems to have happened fundamentally is that these domains that I talked to you about, which can be represented as chaos and order, say an R from the Taoist perspective, can also be represented as masculine and feminine. And I think the reason for that is that human beings are fundamentally social primates, right? We're very, very social. And we know that one of the correlates of brain size in primates is social group size. And we also know that most primates, say chimps, who we're quite closely related to, They don't like go out and investigate leaves and, you know, peer at things through microscopes. They spend all their time interacting with other chimpanzees. Although they're chewing all the time, they do it because they have a ridiculously ineffective, you know, digestive and eating system. Their brain is adapted to the social circumstances as the primary reality. So you could say, well, tribe is the primary reality, and then there's a secondary reality, which is all that which is outside tribe. And that corresponds to chaos and order. Order, in contradiction to chaos, is symbolized by masculine symbols. And that's, for example, why ideologies like radical feminism presume the existence of a patriarchy. It fits into the symbolic structure of our minds, that idea. And it's true in some sense, because just like in chimpanzee troops, the primary or meta-hierarchy that makes up human civilization is fundamentally masculine in its origin and structure. And so masculine is fundamentally the dominance hierarchy, and feminine is fundamentally all the things that are outside or that challenge the dominance hierarchy. And so it's a perfectly reasonable, it's weird, because our brain is organized to fundamentally apprehend the world in terms of personalities. And that's partly because, you know, as we've emerged over the course of evolution, it's been relatively constant that there were males around, and that there were females around, and that the males were fathers, and that the females were mothers, and, you know, that they were both mates as well. It's a constant of the evolutionary landscape, and that's what our brains evolved to process. And then what happened when we developed the capacity to abstract is we used this underlying social cognitive abstraction structure to start to represent the structure of being itself. So we could say, well, there's a dominance hierarchy, and that's society, and that's masculine, and there's all the things that challenge the dominance hierarchy, and they're outside, and they're feminine. The weirdest thing about that, however, is that it actually works. You know, we've got away with that for some reason. It seems to be perfectly reasonable to map the world in that manner. It keeps us going. All right, I'm going to try to explain this. This is an alchemical symbol. At the bottom of the symbol, there's this round thing with wings. Do you ever see Harry Potter? Yeah. You know the game Quidditch? You remember what they chase? They chase a gold one of those. All right, so they call that the snitch, I believe, and there's a little fragment of soul, and it's a very interesting idea because for the alchemists, the primary element of reality, whatever that was, could be conceptualized as this thing, this round chaos. And what it was conceptualized of, in part, was it was a container from which matter and spirit could emerge. And you might ask, well, what does that mean? This is what it means. When a child experiences something it can't predict, it does the thing that led to that uncertain outcome over and over and over and over until it can map it. And then you think, well, what did the child do? What the child did was take the domain of that which it did not understand, and it transformed it into matter, which is the predictable world of entities, and spirit, which is the internal psychological structure that's adapted to that. And so what the alchemists basically conceptualized was that what exists outside of your conceptual framework is something like unrealized potential. And when you interact with that unrealized potential, you actualize it, and you actualize it into two component elements, one being the material world and the other being your own psychological structure. That's why they conceptualized matter and spirit, the container of matter and spirit, as the ultimate reality. And out of that emerged something that was quite primordial, which is the dragon. Now, one of the things we know, you remember in the Genesis story? It's the snake that gives people vision. Remember that? It gives them wisdom, and it also produces self-consciousness. There's a woman named Lynn Isbell who's an anthropologist in LA, and she was very interested in human being sight because we can really see. We can see better than any other creature except predatory birds. We can see way better than most primates. Isbell knew that our tree-dwelling ancestors some 60 million years ago emerged at about the same time as snakes. They're younger than lizards, by the way. And that we were preyed on quite intensely by snakes for tens of millions of years. And she also knew that we were good at detecting snakes in the bottom of our visual field, and that we were particularly good at detecting the camouflage patterns of snakes in the bottom of our visual field. So she did a series of field experiments showing that primate visual acuity was correlated strongly with the presence of predatory snakes in the immediate environment. So, the idea that snakes gave us vision is right. Now, why is that relevant to this? We were preyed upon for a very long period of time, and we developed a neural circuit to deal with predators. And that's the neural circuit that's activated in children when they're terrified about monsters at night. So the predator entity, which is this dragon, it's like an amalgam of predatory forces, is one of the manifestations of the things that exist outside of the dominance hierarchy. So it's a form of primordial reality. It's not abstract anymore like the matter and spirit container. It's like the first practical manifestation of what's terrifying and threatening concretely outside that. And so, remember, animals can respond to threat, but they can't conceptualize threat as a category. That's the conceptualization of threat as a category. It emerges from the absolute unknown. It manifests itself as threat. So, for example, if you hear a loud noise behind you, or a growl when you're in the forest, the first thing that happens is you don't know what's going on. And that's the initial state of contact with potential. And then if you turn around and you look, that potential manifests itself into something that's predatory. And you have a circuit for that. And that's the same circuit that we now use to assess anything unexpected that occurs to us. And that circuit had to come from somewhere. And so our capacity to respond to surprising entities is an elaboration up into abstraction of our capacity to identify predators. So that's the next level of reality. And out of that chaotic circumstance comes something that's more human. And that is the emergence of masculinity and femininity out of that more primordial element. Let me show you